My name is Sean O'Gorman, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to utilize the OpenShift migration toolkit to successfully migrate an ESXi hosted virtual machine over to the OpenShift virtualization platform. Firstly, we will see the VM initially running on ESXi, and I will also show that the application running on the VM is reachable over the ESXi VLAN. From there, I will explain how to configure the provider for virtualization in OCP, as well as setting up and starting the migration plan. Once the plan is started, we can follow the progress of the migration. Upon completion, we will have our VM running in OCP Virt, at which point there are some post-configuration steps required to facilitate access to our application, which I will also guide you through. Okay, we are now on the ESXi dashboard, and from here we can see information associated with the VM we've chosen to migrate. This VM is running an application called Fuckleboard. If we navigate to the IP address configured on the VM, we can see that our application is currently available over the ESXi VLAN. At this point, we need to switch over to OpenShift and begin our configuration of the virtualization provider and the migration plan itself. However, in order to have these components available, both the OpenShift virtualization and migration toolkit operators need to be installed in the cluster as shown here. If we expand the migration tab, we will see pages for configuring providers, as well as creating the plan. We must first configure the provider. The provider establishes the connection to the source endpoint that we are going to be migrating from. In our case, that's ESXi. To create the provider, click on the Create Provider button. Depending on the endpoint you're going to be migrating from, you need to choose the provider type accordingly. In our case, we will choose VM vSphere Provider. We'll give it the resource name we wish to create, and we'll choose the endpoint type. As we're not using vCenter, we'll just use the ESXi type. We'll give it the URL of the ESXi host. And as the migration toolkit uses VDDK to facilitate the transfer of the virtual disk, you need to supply a repository containing a VDDK init image. Instructions on how to create this VDDK image can be found in the migration documentation. We also need to provide the credentials to connect to the ESXi endpoint. And as we're just using a demo lab to facilitate this migration, we're going to skip certificate validation. Finally, create the provider. And once that's created, we should see our provider created and in ready state. Now we're ready to move on to create the plan for migration itself. So we create plan, we give it a name, we can call it migration demo. It's in the OpenShift MTV project, and we can see the provider that we've created here is in ready state, so we'll select that. And we'll see the VMs that are on the ESXi host that are available for migration. In our case, we want to migrate this one. So our target provider is the host, and our target namespace, we'll put it into demo. So this is the namespace that the virtual machine will be created in once it's migrated over. Here we have our network mappings and our storage mappings, and we will create the migration plan. So once we have this migration plan created, it will validate, and we're now ready to start the migration. Now we are ready to start the migration. One further thing to make note of just before we start, there are two types of migration possible, cold or warm. Warm means the source VM remains powered on during the migration. This does require some further configuration on the ESXi side, but for our purposes here, we're using cold migration. This just means that the VM is powered down when the transfer begins. Now we can take a look at the status. We see the various stages of the pipeline. Firstly, the PVC, pod, and data volumes are created on the OpenShift side, and then image conversion and disk transfer stages. How long these stages take will depend on how large the disks are, as well as network bandwidth between OpenShift and the source you are migrating from. While this is in progress, let's take a look in further detail of prerequisite configurations needed to allow the migration tool to communicate with vCenter or ESXi. In order for the migration tool to function properly, firewall ports listed here must be open on the vCenter or ESXi side. If you are migrating from vCenter, these are the full list of granular permissions that the user the migration tool uses to authenticate with must have assigned. Additionally, the URL of either ESXi or vCenter must be resolvable from within the OpenShift cluster. DNS config can be added to the cluster using the DNS operator as shown. Finally, any external device that may have been attached to the VM must be detached and scrubbed from etc fs tab before you start the migration. Now, we can take a look at the post-configuration steps as our VM has been migrated. Okay, so now our VM has been migrated over and is in a running state on our OpenShift virtualization platform. There's a couple of steps we need to do to make sure that our application is actually reachable. So we need to inspect the YAML associated with the VM. We need to come down to spec, template, and this label, app label here. So we need to take note of this. In this case, it's focal board migrate. So we need to create a service. We need to give it the same label. And we can call it whatever we wish. We'll call it focal board service. And we'll select the target port as port 80, as that's what the app is listening on. Okay. Now from here, we need to create a route. Again, we'll give it a name. The host name will be generated first. The path is we don't need to specify for this particular app. We just need to specify the service we created, and then we need to specify the target port. So we hit create, and this will give us our URL. So if we click our URL, let's see that our app is now up and running and available from within OpenShift.